Hello, it's Toaster Party, and today I'm going to be covering the Banlist updates for January 2022. So, there was a Banlist drop today, and there was also one dropped a few days ago that updated what cards are put on the ban list. It impacted many formats. Those include Historic, Standard, Legacy, and Pauper. But without further ado, let's get into the actual changes. So first up, we have Ragavan the Nimble Pilferer, which was just banned in Legacy. So, in a format ruled by tempo swings, Ragavan is probably the best tempo swing on a creature in the 1-drop slot. With Delver already being the best deck, and getting two new, better versions of Delver in Modern Horizons 2, that being Ragavan and DRC, Dragon's Rage Channeler, one of those cards had to go, or else they probably would have hit something like the powerful cantrips that Blue has access to in Legacy, but that's part of the flavor of the format, so the Monkey was the obvious choice for what they had to get rid of. Up next, for the standard bans, the first one up is Faceless Haven. This card is probably what put aggro decks over the top in standard for the longest time ever since rotation hit, because Faceless Haven is an incredibly powerful aggro card. It is a big creature that is immune to board nukes, and generally made all sorcery speed removal unplayable, and the only real cost to the person playing it is that their deck probably had to be slanted more towards monocolors so they could pay the 3 snow to be able to animate it into a creature. And it doesn't even tap because it has Vigilance. Up next, Alvarin's Epiphany. Well, this one is one that's been a long time coming. It was being called for being banned essentially since the rotation hit. It was part of a 2 to 3 card combo that essentially wins the game on the spot, that being with Galvanic Iteration and Hall of the Storm Giants. If you have all 3 of those cards, you are able to put up about 22 points of damage because you take 2 extra turns, make 4 different birds, and are then able to swing with a 7/7. And this card was very difficult for decks to interact with. If you weren't able to hit it with a hand disruption spell on turn 1 in black, they could immediately foretell it on turn 2 so that you could no longer mess with it. The only other color that could really interact with it at that point was blue, which could then counter it. But even then, you're then just getting into a counter war over this card. And with Galvanic Iteration, it's very likely that they resolve at least 1 copy anyway, which puts them into a massive tempo swing that will probably just win them the game anyway. And finally, there was this period of time where they kept the card around because they wanted to see whether or not Crimson Vow would be able to change the impact level of this deck. While Thalia was released to mono white, all that really did was just mean that mono white was probably the better aggro deck to be playing, and it didn't make the Alvarin's Epiphany deck worse against any of the other matchups. In fact, it got more good cards that you could play alongside the Epiphany that just generally made the deck better. So, because they weren't able to power down or power up the other decks in a way that would meaningfully be able to combat the Epiphany deck, Epiphany had to be banned, and I completely agree with their choice to do so. Next up, the one that actually hurts. Divide by Zero banned in Standard. So, Epiphany wasn't the only card that they banned out of the Epiphany decks. I was testing for a while to see how Is It would play without Epiphany. Is It without Epiphany still works, but Divide by Zero and Epiphany both going, that hurts the deck a lot more. So Divide by Zero is by far the best learn card that was printed in Strixhaven. It's basically an unsubstantiate that also doubles as a win con. It provides a massive tempo swing in favor of whoever's using it, because you're both removing a threat, or, well, not fully removing the threat, you are causing your opponent to waste mana to either recast it the next turn, and sometimes this card can essentially read as a 3 mana extra turn because they tap out to cast some massive creature and they just get it bounced back to hand. And you don't even just bounce it back to hand. You get to either loot one or pull one of the many different lesson cards from your sideboard into your hand. Usually being either the Environmental Sciences, which gains you 2 life and searches you a land, which is pretty good, especially when you're trying to win that life point race, or Mascot Exhibition, which basically serves as a secondary win condition for your control deck, because it makes enough bodies that you can either wall yourself up or be able to go in for lethal. I'm a bit sad to see this one go, because I was playing this one in a Lear Is It Control list, and this is probably one of the best cards to interact with Lear, because it both can protect your Lear by bouncing it back, because you can target your own stuff with it, and it also works sort of as a counter that you could cast from yard, even through Lear's effect that says you can't counter stuff. So I'm very sad to see this one go. I can sort of understand, because the card is incredibly powerful, but it doesn't change the fact that I am very, very annoyed to not have this and not sure what I'm playing. Okay, and now for the not really super important one. They officially banned Memory Lapse, meaning people who had this card are finally getting their refunded wild cards. They should have just banned this card forever ago. This card is like the equivalent to Standard's Divide by Zero, but this was even worse, because it wasn't just your opponent losing their mana. It was in a even greater sense more like a 2 mana extra turn spell, because you didn't just waste their mana to cast whatever they were casting. You then steal their next draw step away from them by putting that card that they would have cast on top of their deck instead of into their yard. So you're essentially going +1 in card economy with this, and you're going for a massive tempo swing with this. This card was backbreaking against a ton of strategies that couldn't find a way to break out of Memory Lapse, because if you had more than one, you essentially just win the game from that point. Your opponent can't really progress their board state, because they're not drawing anything. They're drawing what they were attempting to cast over and over again. And then there was another thing that they did, and that is rebalance Teferi Time Raveler. I don't remember what exactly the rebalance was. I believe they just changed up the casting cost and made the abilities a little bit more steep, like making it so that Teferi started at like a 3, so you couldn't just bounce and then start ticking him up again. I believe that was the changes made to the card. It's definitely not as good now, but it's probably might see you play because its first effect still applies. And then finally, we have the slightly older set of bans, but this was for bans in Pauper, that being banning several pillars of the format, that being Atog, Prophetic Prism, and Bonder's Ornament. So these are a very strange set of bans, but make a bit of sense. Atog has been the strongest card in Affinity for a while, and ever since Modern Horizons 2 came out, Affinity has been sitting near or at the top of the metagame pile, because the additional, just general support cards and the tapped dual artifact lands made the deck a lot better, and having more things to sack to Atog just made whether that being flinging it or using a Temur Battle Rage to make sure that it deals lethal damage, a bit too easy. I'm hoping that because they decided to ban Atog now after already banning Sojourner's Companion, that they give Companion back to Affinity decks, because losing 2 cards in a row is a bit brutal. And it's not just 2 cards, because up next we have Prophetic Prism. This is a card that has been played in Pauper for a very, very long time, as far back as I can remember focusing on the format, because Prophetic Prism has been around, I believe, as long as the format has been, because it was initially released in, I believe, Rise of the Eldrazi, if I remember correctly. It is a 2-mana artifact that when it enters the battlefield, you draw a card, and you can pay 1 and tap it to add 1 mana of any color to your mana pool. So when Arkham's Astrolabe was released into the format, it basically homogenized the format into whatever decks could play the card. Prophetic Prism was basically already doing the same thing that Arkham's Astrolabe was doing, but just at a worse rate. And the fact is that with a Tog out of the way, one of the other best decks is Tron, a deck that abuses Prophetic Prism better than any other deck. And other decks that used to run Prophetic Prism don't need it as much as they used to, as there being a lot more copies of 2-mana artifacts that draw a card when they ETB. So really the only thing that Prophetic Prism is being used for is for mana fixing, and currently Tron's mana fixing is a bit too good because they're essentially playing a 5-color best of deck. And up next we have basically a card that's getting banned for the exact same reason as Prophetic Prism, that being Bonder's Ornament. When most people looked at this card in their Commander deck, they just saw it as just being generally bad. And in Commander, yeah, it's generally bad. It is essentially a Manalith, but has the secondary ability of being able to tap for and it to make every player who controls a Bonder's Ornament draw a card. So, essentially it's a repeatable draw engine in Pauper, of which there are not many, and especially none that are this good. This both focused as a way to fix your mana in Tron, and it also just showed up in a lot of other decks that just really wanted the free draws that could spend their mana that way. But this is mostly another Tron ban because it is both mana fixing and Tron can easily pay that 4 mana better than any other deck could. So the Pauper bans were essentially hit Affinity and hit Tron, as both of the first 2 cards saw play in Affinity and both of the last 2 cards here saw play in Tron. Well, hope you enjoyed the video. Thank you all for watching. Hope you leave a like, comment, and subscribe, and I hope you all have an excellent day. Bye.